This is the second lecture of chapter 14 that is the new material for final exam, and we're talking about now angiosperms, or the flowering plants. These are the most diverse and successful plants, and you know this, you just don't realize it because these are the plants that you see and eat every day. So let's see who they are. So the angiosperms, these are things like most of the trees. So think about trees that are not evergreens. These are trees and bushes that create fruits, the ones that create things like flowers. So you've got a water lily. So some of these do live in water, but they have roots that go into soil. Things like lavender, all the different herbs are going to be in this group, and also the grasses. So who are we looking at? Flowering trees, bushes, herbs, grasses. These are the majority of the plants that we see today. So what do they have in common? So they have vascular tissue, just like the vascular seedless plants and the gymnosperms. But what's different is that instead of producing their gametes in cones like the gymnosperms, they actually produce their gametes in flowers. So this is the flower group, and so the flowers can look very different. You might not think, well, grass is a flowering plant, but you've actually seen grass flowers. You just don't recognize them as flowers because they don't have the big flashy petals that we think of as flowers. I've got pictures of those later on in my slides. The seeds are enclosed in what we call an ovule, or you know it better as a fruit rather than in a cone. So we've got all of those seeds contained within some sort of structure. So the thing is that what we think of as fruits usually are things like oranges, apples, and so forth. But even things like those helicopter seeds and cucumbers and squash, those are fruits as well because they have seeds inside of that structure. So yeah, I know you've been told all of your life that peas and green beans are vegetables, but according to biology, they are fruits because they have seeds inside of them, which makes them a fruit. So let's take a look at the big thing that makes angiosperms, and that is the flower. Now, this picture is from your textbook, and you'll see that some of the names are blacked out. I'm not asking you to know the names of those structures, but you should know the names and functions of the other structures we're going to talk about here. So the big one that everybody's familiar with is the petal. So the petals on flowers have one job and only one job, and that is to attract pollinators. So these are the advertisement. These are the, hey, look at me, come over here sort of structure for flowers. It's the way to get the pollinators to come. Now, some of them, as we'll see, aren't super flashy because they just need to be a structure for the pollinator to walk on, but most of them do have color and pattern in order for the pollinators to be able to see them and notice them to come over to the flower. So they are mostly, for our flowers, a billboard. Now, not all flowers will have petals. Like I said, I have pictures of things like grass that don't have petals. So they're not a requirement in order to be a flower. Now, the other two pieces are requirements. They don't all have to show up on the flower, but these are what makes a flower a flower. So we've got on this side, we've got marked the male reproductive structure. So these long skinny pieces are the stamens. So the stamens are the male reproductive structure. You might notice that there are two arrows. You don't need to worry about knowing the names of these guys, but just know that this is the stamen, and the stamen is the part that actually produces the pollen. So they're producing the sperm that are packed into those pollen grains. So if you've ever rubbed I don't know if any of you have done this when you were younger or even recently, if you've rubbed a dandelion on the back of your hand, that yellow that is on there, part of it is from the petals, but a good amount of that is going to be pollen from these stamens. Also, this is what makes a lot of us sneeze. We are actually having an allergic reaction to the pollen that's being put off by flowers. So yeah, think about that. You're being made to sneeze by plant sperm. So yeah. So you've got pollen packed into the stamens. We've got petals attracting pollinators. That main function is to pick up this pollen because we want the pollen to get moved around from flower to flower. We don't want a flower to be pollinated by itself. And then the last set of structures are the female reproductive structures. So the female reproductive structure is this whole center section, and there are different parts. We've got the stigma. The stigma is this sticky end right here. Very often it is kind of lobed. Sometimes it's spiky, but it's going to have different sections to it. And it's going to release some sticky material. It's sticky so that the pollen will stick to it. And you'll see that in some of the videos later on where you've got pollinators coming in and bringing in pollen. The pollen is going to stick to the stigma, and that's the goal, because then the pollen's actually going to start to burrow its way through. And it's going to burrow its way down the stalk right here. The stalk is called the style. And the only function of the style, so the stigma's job is to catch the pollen. The style's job is just to connect the stigma to the next section. And this last section is what we call the ovary. The ovary contains the ovules, or the version of eggs for an angiosperm. These are what will become the seeds if they get fertilized. So the sperm in the pollen will travel down, dig down through the style, and then travel around and up into this area, and then fertilize the ovule and become a seed. So if you cut open a flower, this section right here is going to contain the baby seeds. If it's been fertilized, it'll actually contain big seeds. If you open up a pea, if you've ever done this, if you open up a pea pod and you notice that all of the peas are big and fat, and then there's one that has like a little missing one, or a little tiny one hanging out there, that little tiny one is one that did not get fertilized. I'll see if I've got any in my refrigerator that have done this, because I do have some down there, so that I can show you what that looks like in another video. So yeah, flowers for the most part need pollinators. We'll see that there are a few that don't use pollinators, but for the most part, angiosperms have evolved relationships with pollinators. So why are those flowers flashy? Like I said, it's a billboard, it's an advertisement. It's a way to get them there. Now, once you get your pollinators there are two options. You can either trick your pollinator, or you can bribe your pollinator. That way they will go from flower to flower. So we can trick or we can bribe. And so you can see some pictures here. I've got a video that I will post for this one, just so you can see how this trick works. And then we'll talk about the bribe too. So trickery. So there's two options that we commonly see with trickery. One is that you mimic the other sex of your pollinator. So here, the video that you'll watch here, I'll have it linked up. The flowers for these orchids look like female wasps or female bees. There are different groups of these, actually. There's lots of different species that do this. And so they look like female wasps or bees, and they actually even smell like female wasps or bees. And so they'll, as you'll see, attract male wasps or bees to the flower, and that is basically a signal. The way they look and smell is that these females are ready to mate. And so the males try to mate with the orchid, and in the process, get pollinated. So they get either pollen attached to them or by different means, or they get covered in pollen and then realize that this mating isn't going to happen. It isn't a female wasp or bee. And so then they leave and try it again on another flower and move the pollen from flower to flower. So look for the orchid bee video on Panther Learn so you can see how that works. The other option is to smell like their food. This is a common trick for flowers that use flies as pollinators. And so I'll have this one linked up as well. So this one is common to smell like dead, rotting meat. That's the most common trick as far as this goes. And so the one that you're going to see, they're going to these flowers are big, usually. There's actually small ones too. A lot of these are from the tropics, but the flowers are big and they smell like rotting meat that attracts flies to come in, pick up the pollen, and then they wander around for a while, realize that there's not a dead animal, and then fly away and hopefully go and find another flower and do the same thing. So these are the two most common tricks that we see plants doing. They're not giving any sort of reward. The other option is for bribes. This is where you're going to offer some sort of thing of value for transporting the pollen. So the most common thing of value that is offered is food. And so this is going to require some things on the part of the plant. The plant is going to need to produce a sticky pollen. And this is actually true for trickery or bribery. The pollen is going to have to be sticky in order for this to work because it has to stay stuck to the pollinator to get from flower to flower. But you also need a flower that catches the attention of the pollinator. Again, true for trickery or bribery. You're going to need to have some way to get that pollinator to come. You'll see in the videos for the trickery, they either look like a female, or with the ones that smell like dead meat, they look kind of like dead meat. For bribery, you're going to basically put out there that billboard and say, hey, come over here, and they're going to attract specific pollinators. The last thing though, and this is where the bribery comes in, you actually give something of value to the pollinator. And so with bribery, that means that you're going to give them usually food. And in most cases for the flowers, it's going to be nectar, that sugary water that we find in flowers. If any of you have ever picked clover flowers and pulled the flowers out and sucked to the bottom of them, you've found this. If you haven't done it, you've missed out, and you should give it a try. The big purple clover flowers work the best. And so that nectar is actually the reward for the pollinator to go flower to flower and pick up the pollen. For some flowers, actually, they produce extra pollen for bees so that the bees will pick up pollen. They take the extra pollen back to their hives as a food source because it's got a lot of protein in it, but they transfer the pollen from flower to flower. Other bribes include things like housing. There are a couple of species of flowers that actually work to protect and house their pollinators. So that's how they will get them to keep coming back. Now, I mentioned that they evolved together. And so the thing is that these flowers have specifically evolved for specific pollinators. So the colors are important. White flowers are going to attract moths and bats because they're going to be light in color. They're going to be white or yellow, and that's going to reflect the moonlight. That's going to be able to be seen at night. While bright colors like reds and oranges and yellows are going to be able to be seen by visual pollinators that during the day, like birds, butterflies, and bees. So I'm going to stop here. I'll pick back up with more between plants and their pollinators in the next lecture. So I'll be back.